Hannah always arrived before everyone else. She liked the silence of the empty office, with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the low hum of the air conditioner. She would tidy her desk, check her emails, review the reports. She had been doing this for almost 10 years, but even after all that time at the company, it felt like no one there really saw her. When the others arrived, Hannah just became one of the crowd, someone they greeted with a quick nod, but never truly listened to. She was an administrative assistant at a logistics company. The work was demanding, full of details. Hannah knew every process in the company better than any manager. She knew where the bottlenecks were, where money was being lost, where things could be improved, but no one ever asked for her opinion. And when she tried to speak, the same thing always happened. Someone would interrupt her, or talk over her, as if she were invisible. The first time it happened, Hannah thought it was just carelessness. A colleague in a hurry, a manager pressed for time. But after years of seeing it happen every week, she started to believe that maybe she was the problem. Maybe she didn't know how to assert herself. Maybe her voice was too quiet. Or maybe no one really cared. In meetings, she would prepare comprehensive reports. She'd spend hours organizing everything to make it clear, easy to understand. But when she'd start to present, a supervisor would interrupt her and say he was going to move the agenda along. When she tried to get back on track, another manager would change the subject. And just like that, her voice would disappear in the noise of other voices. Hannah would come home every day with a tight feeling in her chest. Her husband, Roger, told her she needed to speak up, that she needed to pound the table, command respect. But that wasn't her. She couldn't shout to be heard. She always thought her work should speak for itself, that if she was competent, eventually someone would notice. But time went on, and nothing changed. She remembered when she was a child, her mother telling her that polite girls don't speak loudly, that women needed to be discreet. Hannah grew up trying to fit in. She never wanted to draw attention. She just wanted to do her job well. But deep down, she had a dream she kept to herself, to be recognized for what she knew, to be able to speak without being cut off, to have the space to show her ideas. In the office, everyone knew Hannah as someone reliable. If someone needed an urgent report, they asked her. If they needed help with a complicated spreadsheet, she was the one they called. But when it came time to give credit, someone else always got the praise. The manager would say, "Thanks, Carlos, for the work." And Carlos would smile, without mentioning that it was Hannah who had done it all. She began to think this would be her fate forever. To do, to organize, to solve, but never to be heard. Sometimes she thought about quitting, about disappearing from there and starting over somewhere else. But whenever she thought about it, she remembered the mortgage, the monthly bills, her son who went to a private school, and she would give up. She preferred to swallow her pride than to let her family down. Even so, inside, she felt she was growing tired. It wasn't just her body that ached at the end of the day. It was her heart, tired of having so much to say and never being able to. Tired of always being interrupted. Tired of having to prove every day that she was capable. Until one day, the owner of the company announced there would be a general meeting. He said the financial situation was difficult, that the transportation sector was losing money, and they needed ideas to save the company. The mood in the office grew heavy. Some colleagues started saying there would be layoffs. Others said the company was going to close. Hannah listened quietly, but she could feel her heart racing, because deep down, she knew she had some of the answers. She knew where the mistakes were that no one wanted to see. That night, Hannah got home and couldn't eat. She sat at the table, staring at nothing. Roger asked her what had happened. She told him about the meeting and said that this might be her chance to finally show her worth. But she was afraid. Afraid of opening her mouth and no one letting her finish. Afraid of, once again, being silenced before she could say what she needed to. Roger held her hand and said, "Hannah, no one is going to give you the space. You're going to have to take it." She was silent, because she knew he was right. And for the first time, she started to think that maybe it was time to do things differently. On the morning of the meeting, Hannah woke up before the alarm. She lay there staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding, imagining how the meeting would go. She could already hear her colleagues' loud voices, interrupting each other, and her trying to speak without success. Her husband, Roger, appeared at the bedroom door, his hair still messy, and asked if she was okay. Hannah said she was, but she didn't look it. Her stomach was in knots, as if she had swallowed a brick. She went to work earlier than ever. She sat at her desk, opened her computer, and read, once again, the report she had prepared months ago. A detailed document where she pointed out where the high costs were, the logistical errors, the opportunities for improvement. No one had ever read that entire report. It just sat forgotten in a folder on the server. But Hannah knew the answers to save the company were in there. As people started to arrive, Hannah tried to stay calm, but the office already had a different vibe. Everyone was speaking softly, suspiciously. Some were whispering that the company was going to lay off half the staff. Others said they were going to shut down entire departments. Hannah heard it all, but said nothing. She kept thinking, if I don't speak now, I'll never get another chance. When 10 o'clock struck, they called everyone into the conference room. It was a large room, full of black chairs, with a long wooden table in the middle. The director, Mr. Damien, was there, looking serious, a folder in his hands. He began to speak, explaining that the company was operating at a loss. He said that if they didn't find solutions soon, they would have to take drastic measures. Hannah felt a chill. She looked around. She saw tense faces, people biting the ends of their pens, tapping their feet on the floor. After Mr. Damien finished speaking, he asked if anyone had any ideas to help the company. An awkward silence fell. No one wanted to say anything. It seemed like everyone was afraid to commit. Hannah took a deep breath. Her hand was shaking. She started to raise her arm but lowered it again. The fear was greater. Fear of someone cutting her off mid-sentence. Fear of being laughed at. It was then that Carlos, an analyst, stepped forward and started saying a lot of things, mostly generic. He said the problem was the market, that the crisis was the government's fault, that there wasn't much to be done. The others nodded along, as if he were the only one who knew what he was talking about. Hannah listened to it all and thought, it's not just that. There's a way, but no one wants to hear it. Carlos went on, taking up all the time. The director thanked him and asked if anyone else had anything to add. Hannah tried to speak, starting to say, I have some ideas, but the director didn't let her continue. He said they were out of time, that they would schedule another meeting, and he ended it. Hannah just sat there, wanting to cry. She watched everyone get up and leave, talking loudly, as if nothing had happened. She was left with a horrible feeling, as if she were invisible. She clutched the report she had brought against her chest. When she left the room, she heard 2 colleagues laughing, saying she was trying to show off. That cut deep. At lunchtime, Hannah was alone. She sat on a bench in the company garden, slowly eating her lunch. She thought about giving up. Thought that maybe her place really was to stay quiet. But inside her, there was a voice that kept saying, you know what you're doing. You have the answers. When she got back to her desk, she saw an email from Mr. Damien scheduling another meeting for the following week. The subject was, Last Chance for Recovery Ideas. Hannah felt her heart beat faster. She thought, it's now or never. That night, at home, Hannah sat with Roger in the living room and told him everything. She said she couldn't stand being interrupted anymore. Roger held her hand and said seriously, you have 2 options. Either you stay quiet for the rest of your life, or you say what you have to say, even if they tell you to shut up 100 times, because if you don't speak, no one listens. Hannah looked at her husband, thinking. Deep down, she knew he was right, but she also knew that for someone who had spent years being quiet, raising her voice felt like climbing a mountain. The next day, Hannah woke up still thinking about Roger's words. As she brushed her teeth, she looked at her reflection in the mirror and repeated to herself, this time, I'm going to speak, even if I have to scream. But her voice sounded so quiet that even she had doubts she could do it. She went to the company early, sat at her desk and opened her computer. She started to write down everything she wanted to say in the meeting. She made simple bullet points, easy words, so she wouldn't get tangled up. As she typed, she felt her heart beat faster. Each written sentence seemed to give her a little more strength. In the middle of the text, she stopped, stared at the screen and thought, what if no one listens to me again? What if they laugh in my face? But she shook her head, trying to push the fear away. In the factory, the mood remained heavy. The layoff rumors were getting stronger. People spoke in low voices, suspicious, as if any conversation could be overheard by the bosses. Some colleagues would pass by Hannah and ask if she knew anything. She would just say no, but inside, she wanted to scream, yes, I do! I know what's wrong! But she couldn't. In the hallway, she ran into Carlos, the one who always talked in meetings. He came walking fast, slapping his briefcase against his leg, and asked if she had any ideas to save the company. Hannah said yes, that she had been studying the numbers for months. But before she could say anything else, Carlos interrupted her, saying that he himself was already preparing a new plan and that he would present it at the next meeting. Hannah just gave a weak smile, but inside she felt angry. She thought that he had no idea what he was talking about, that he never bothered to look at the reports properly. At coffee break, Hannah was in the break room, stirring sugar into her coffee, when she heard two colleagues talking about the meeting. One of them said, "All I know is if Hannah starts talking, it's going to take forever. She speaks so quietly, no one can understand a thing." Hannah stood there, her spoon in her cup, feeling her face burn. She thought about saying something, but she swallowed hard and went back to her desk. At lunchtime, she went for a walk outside the company. She walked along the sidewalk, looking at the shops, the cars passing by. She thought about how her life had always been like this. In school, she was the quiet girl no one listened to. At home, as a child, her older brothers would talk over her. At family birthdays, she could barely tell a story without being interrupted. It seemed she was born to be quiet, but now, everything was on the line. When she got back, she found Mr. Roberts, one of the company's oldest employees. He asked if she was worried. Hannah said yes, and mentioned she had some ideas to save the company. Mr. Roberts looked at her, scratched his chin, and said, "Hannah, you're the only one who really understands this company. But you know what the problem is? Nobody in there listens to someone who speaks quietly. And you speak very quietly." Hannah didn't know what to say. She just smiled faintly, but that echoed in her head for the rest of the day. That evening, Hannah went home and decided she needed to practice. She asked Roger to sit on the sofa and began to read him everything she had written for the meeting. At first, her voice came out almost in a whisper. Roger kept saying, "Louder, Han. Firmer. You're saying important things." Hannah tried. Each time she read it louder, until, after almost an hour, Roger said, "That's it. Now I believe no one will be able to shut you up." She smiled, but she still wasn't sure. Because in her head, the image of Carlos interrupting, or the director cutting her off, was stronger than any rehearsal. That night, Hannah lay in bed, looking at the ceiling and thinking. She knew she could still back down. She could go to the meeting and stay quiet as always. But at the same time, she knew that if she didn't speak now, she might never get another chance. And deep down, she began to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Anger. Not a destructive anger, but an anger that pushed her forward. A voice inside her said, "Enough, I'm going to speak, and they are going to listen." The day of the decisive meeting arrived. Hannah woke up before sunrise with her heart racing. She made a strong coffee but couldn't drink more than 2 sips. Her stomach was so twisted it felt like she was going to be sick. She stood in the kitchen, looking at the clock, taking deep breaths, repeating to herself, "Today I will speak. Today no one will silence me." Roger appeared at the door, a little sleepy, and asked if she was ready. Hannah said yes, but her voice was trembling. He came closer, held her face in his hands, and said, "Hannah, remember one thing. They might try to silence you, but you're the one who knows the answers. You're not making anything up. You've studied. You live this company. They're the ones who should be quiet to listen to you." Hannah took a deep breath and nodded, trying to believe him. She took the bus to the company, but it felt like the ride would never end. The swaying of the bus made her feel even more nauseous. She looked at the people around her, each with their phone, their headphones, and thought about how she was about to do the hardest thing in her life. When she arrived, she walked into the factory and went straight to her desk. She opened her computer, read what she had written one last time. She deleted a few words, made everything shorter, more direct. She didn't want to give anyone the chance to interrupt by saying she was taking too long. At 10 o'clock, the announcement appeared on the monitors. All employees in the administrative sector must report to the conference room. Hannah felt her legs weaken. She walked slowly toward it, holding the folder with her reports. The hallway seemed longer than usual, each step echoing like thunder. Almost everyone was already in the room. Mr. Damien, the director, stood at the front, his face serious. Carlos was there too, arms crossed, looking overly confident. Hannah chose a chair in the corner, but then changed her mind and sat closer to the center. She thought, "If I stay in the corner, no one will even remember I'm here." Mr. Damien began to speak. He said the company's situation had worsened, that if they didn't come up with concrete solutions, they might have to cut half the workforce. The silence in the room was heavy. Hannah looked around, seeing worried faces, people scratching their heads. biting their pens. The director asked if anyone had anything to say. Carlos stood up immediately. He opened a folder and began to speak. He said a lot of nice-sounding but empty phrases, that they needed to reduce costs, increase efficiency, cut benefits. He threw around random numbers that didn't match the factory's reality. Hannah felt her blood boil. She knew it was all a load of hot air, and for the first time, she couldn't stay quiet. She raised her hand. Mr. Damien said, "Hold on. Carlos is still speaking." Hannah sat back down, feeling her face flush, but Carlos talked and talked without stopping, until the director cut him off, saying it was time to hear from other people. He asked again, "Does anyone else want to speak?" Hannah raised her hand high. Mr. Damien looked at her, surprised, and said, "Hannah, what do you have to say?" The room fell silent. Carlos snorted and crossed his arms. Hannah stood up. Her legs were shaking so much it felt like they would buckle. She began to speak, her voice quiet at first, but she didn't stop. She said she had been studying the reports for months, that she knew where the company was losing money. She pointed out the excess of idle machines, the waste of materials, the unsold stock. She said she had simple ideas that could save thousands of dollars without having to fire anyone. At first, people didn't seem to be paying attention, but as Hannah spoke, heads began to turn in her direction. The director leaned forward, interested. Even Carlos stopped fiddling with his phone and looked up. Hannah took a report out of her folder and handed it to the director. She said everything was explained in there. Every point she made, she showed where it was on the paper. She spoke with a firm voice, the way she had rehearsed with Roger, and for the first time, no one interrupted. When she finished, Hannah sat down slowly, breathless, feeling her face flush, her heart hammering in her chest. The room was silent for a few seconds. Then, Mr. Damien said, "Hannah, why have you never said this before?" And she answered, her voice steady, "Because no one ever let me." When Hannah answered that no one had ever let her speak, the room went completely silent. It seemed like even the sound of the air conditioner had stopped. Mr. Damien just stared at her, without saying anything, as if it were the first time he was truly seeing who Hannah was. After a few seconds, he cleared his throat and said, "Hannah, explain to me more about this part on material waste." She opened the folder and pointed to the report. She began to speak with confidence, showing numbers, explaining simply. She said that every month, tons of material were thrown away due to a lack of inventory control. That if they just put one employee in charge of logging what comes in and what goes out, they would already save almost $20,000 a month. The director kept nodding, impressed. As she spoke, Hannah felt something inside her was changing. Every word that came out of her mouth seemed to make her stronger. Her voice trembled less. Her face was less red. The colleagues around her were all paying attention, even Carlos, who was sitting with a sour look on his face, not daring to interrupt. Mr. Damien asked her to also talk about the idle machines. Hannah explained that several machines would sit for days without running because no one managed a preventive maintenance schedule, that this caused production delays, dissatisfied customers, and, consequently, the loss of contracts. She said that if they did small repairs before the machines broke down completely, they could save up to $100,000 a year. And she said all of this in a calm, firm tone, looking the director in the eye. The employees began to whisper among themselves. Some were nodding positively. Others looked at Hannah as if they were seeing her for the first time, because until that moment, everyone had always thought of Hannah as just the quiet woman who took care of the reports. No one imagined she held so much information, so much analysis. Carlos finally couldn't stay quiet and said, "But those numbers are just theory. In practice, it's not that simple." Hannah turned her face slowly toward him and replied, "I know it's not simple, Carlos, but I'm there every day. I see those idle machines. I see the material being wasted. It's not theory, it's reality." Her tone was so firm that Carlos fell silent. Mr. Damien asked Hannah to leave the report with him. He said he would analyze everything carefully. Before ending the meeting, he looked at everyone and said, "I think we learned a lesson today. Sometimes, the best answers come from the people we listen to the least." And looking directly at Hannah, he added, "Thank you, Hannah. You saved the day." When the meeting was over, everyone began to leave the room. Some colleagues passed by Hannah and gave her a pat on the shoulder, saying, "Good job, Hannah," or, "I didn't know you knew so much." She smiled, but still felt a mix of happiness and nervousness. She didn't know if this would really change anything or if, next week, everything would go back to the way it was. In the hallway, Carlos cornered her and said, in a somewhat dry tone, "You did well in there, but be careful not to show off too much." Hannah looked him right in the eye and said, "I don't want to show off. I just want to be able to speak." Carlos was left without a response and walked away. Hannah went back to her desk, trembling. She sat down, took a deep breath, and felt her chest ache with so much adrenaline. She ran her hands through her hair, trying to calm down. A new email popped up on her screen. It was from Mr. Damien. He said he wanted to talk to her alone, the next day, to discuss the future of the company. Hannah stared at the message for a few seconds, in disbelief. That night, at home, Hannah told Roger everything. She said she had finally said everything that had been bottled up for years. Roger smiled, proud, and said, "See, Hannah, no one is going to silence you anymore." She smiled too, but she was still afraid. Afraid of everything going back to normal. Afraid of being silenced again. But deep down, a part of her felt that something had changed forever. She lay in bed, stared at the dark ceiling of her room, and whispered to herself, "I spoke," and they listened. For the first time, that sentence felt more powerful than any shout. The next day, Hannah woke up before her alarm. She opened her eyes in the dark and lay there for a few seconds, listening to the silence of the house. Roger was sleeping beside her, breathing deeply. She got up slowly, went to the bathroom and washed her face. She looked in the mirror, and for the first time in a long time, saw someone different. Not the faded woman no one let speak, but a woman who, despite her fear, had opened her mouth and said what needed to be said. She arrived at the company early. The commute felt different. The bus jolted as always. The streets were crowded, but everything felt lighter. Hannah held her folder with the reports tightly, feeling as if she were carrying something very valuable. She knew that day could be decisive. When she walked into the factory, she felt some different looks. 2 colleagues from finance passed her and said, "Good morning, Hannah," in a tone she had never heard before. It wasn't just politeness, it was respect. She went to her desk, turned on her computer, and saw that Mr. Damien had scheduled their talk for 9 o'clock sharp. There wasn't much time. Every minute felt like an eternity. At 9, she stood up, smoothed her blouse, took a deep breath, and went to the director's office. She knocked on the door with a cold hand. Mr. Damien was inside, working on spreadsheets on his computer. When he saw Hannah, he smiled faintly and said, "Come in, Hannah. Sit down." She sat, holding the folder tightly in her lap. The director began by thanking her for her courage in the previous day's meeting. He said he was impressed not only with the numbers, but with her clarity in explaining things. He said that if she hadn't spoken up, he himself would never have realized the extent of some of the problems. Hannah listened, a bit awkwardly, fidgeting with her hands in her lap. She wasn't used to receiving compliments like that, especially from someone so high up in the hierarchy. Mr. Damien asked if she would be willing to present those ideas at a meeting with the company's board, which would take place in 2 weeks. Hannah's eyes widened. The board was made up of the company's owners, important people who almost never showed up in the day-to-day. Hannah swallowed hard and asked if he was sure. The director said he was. He said that for the first time in a long time, he felt real hope of saving the company, and that he needed Hannah to be the one to present everything, because only she knew how to explain it properly. Hannah felt her heart race. Part of her wanted to say no, wanted to hide, to go back to the safety of her desk, of her silent reports. But another part screamed inside her that this was her chance to show who she was. She told Mr. Damien, "I'll do it. You can count on me." The director smiled. He said he would help her prepare, that he would schedule rehearsals, so she would be comfortable when it was time to speak to the board. Hannah felt a relief so great she almost cried right there. She left the office with her legs weak, but with her chest puffed out. When she got back to her department, some colleagues looked on curiously. Carlos, the same as always, asked what the director wanted with her. Hannah just replied, "Company business," and went to sit at her desk. Carlos just stared, with a sour look on his face. At lunchtime, Caesar, the guy from the IT department, approached her in the cafeteria. He sat next to her and said, "Hannah, you were amazing yesterday. I've worked here for 6 years, and I've never seen anyone say what you said. You have no idea how much respect you've gained." Hannah smiled, a bit shy, and said she was just trying to help. But inside, she felt something much bigger. She felt that she was finally being heard. That evening, Hannah went home and told Roger everything. She said she was going to speak to the board. Roger broke into a huge smile and said, I always knew they'd have to listen to you eventually." Hannah hugged him tightly. She was scared, of course, but she was also happy. For the first time, she felt she no longer had to be silent. She felt she could be herself, without apologizing for existing. Before sleeping, she sat on the edge of the bed, took out her phone, and read the report one more time. Every sentence, every number, she memorized as if it were a song. She knew the challenge would be enormous, but something inside her said that this time, she would no longer let anyone cut her off. In the following days, Hannah lived in a mix of anxiety and excitement. Every morning, she would wake up thinking about what she needed to practice, what she could improve. Sometimes, she would take her phone and record her own voice, speaking the topics from the report. When she listened back, she thought she was speaking too quietly, so she would start all over again, trying to speak more firmly, more clearly. At the company, Mr. Damien started calling her in almost every day to rehearse. He'd have her go into the empty conference room and present the report as if it were for the board. At first, Hannah would stammer, lose her train of thought. She'd blush, look at the floor, but little by little she got better. Each time her voice came out louder, more confident. The director would praise her. "That's it, Hannah. Speak simply, the way you speak. You know this factory better than anyone." Each compliment made Hannah emotional. She would leave the meetings with her heart pounding, but also full of pride. Meanwhile, the layoff rumors didn't stop at the company. Many employees would come to talk to Hannah, asking if she knew anything. She would just say she was working to help the company stay on its feet. Some colleagues started to look at her with respect. Others, with envy. Carlos, especially, would walk around with a scowl, passing her without even a greeting. One day at the coffee machine, Carlos provoked her, saying loudly for everyone to hear, "Now Hannah thinks she's a manager, right? Going to save the company all by herself." Hannah took a deep breath. She turned to him and said, in a calm tone, "I'm not a manager, Carlos, but if I have an idea that can help save everyone's job, yes, I'm going to speak up." The others fell silent. Even Cesar from IT patted her on the back afterward and said, "Well said." That night, Hannah came home exhausted. She threw her bag on the sofa and stood in the middle of the living room, taking a deep breath. Roger asked if she was okay. Hannah said yes, but confessed she was terrified. She said that sometimes she still felt the urge to go back to being quiet, so she wouldn't have to deal with the dirty looks. Roger held her face and said, "You have no idea how strong you are. You were quiet for years. Now no one will silence you again." In the following days, Hannah continued to rehearse. She took the reports home, read them out loud. Sometimes Pete, her son, would sit on the sofa and listen to his mother talk about broken machines, about waste, about costs. He would nod his head, even without understanding everything, and say, "Mom, you talk nice." That made Hannah smile. A week before the board meeting, Mr. Damien called Hannah into his office and said, "Hannah, I'd like you to present the data on the inventory as well. Do you think you can handle it?" Hannah swallowed hard. It was a lot of responsibility, but she replied, "I can handle it." The director smiled and said, "That's what I like to hear." At the factory, the layoff rumors grew stronger. Some employees started to be cold to Hannah, thinking she was getting too close to management, but others began to defend her, saying, if it weren't for Hannah, no one would know the factory still had a chance. This division distressed Hannah. She didn't want to be seen as a suck-up. She just wanted to save the place where she worked, where she had given years of her life. That evening, she left the company and went straight to the home of Mr. Alden, the company's accountant, who had also known Hannah for years. She asked him to review the numbers in the report one more time. Mr. Alden was impressed with the clarity of her spreadsheets. He said, "Hannah, these numbers here are better than what a lot of expensive consulting firms produce. You should have spoken up a long time ago." Hannah replied, "The thing is, no one would let me speak." The accountant shook his head and said, "Well, now you're going to speak, and you're going to speak loudly." On the way home, Hannah sat on the bus, watching the sky darken out the window. She thought about everything that was about to happen, about the fear, the risk, but she also thought that she couldn't go back now, because this time, everyone was watching her, and for the first time, she really wanted to be heard. The day of the board meeting arrived. Hannah woke up before sunrise, unable to eat anything. She put on the best blouse she owned, simple but well-ironed, and tied her hair in a firm bun. As she applied lipstick in the mirror, she whispered to herself, "It's going to be okay. You know all of this. No one is going to silence you today." On the bus, she held her folder so tight she almost crumpled the paper. Her heart felt like it was going to beat out of her chest. She kept repeating each phrase of the report, each number in her head. She thought about the faces of the company's owners, people she only saw from a distance in the hallways, men in suits who never even knew her name. She got to the company and went straight to the restroom, washed her face, took a deep breath. When she came out, some colleagues looked at her differently, some with admiration, others with suspicion. It felt like everyone was talking about her. But in that moment, Hannah didn't care, because she knew that, for the first time, she was going to fight for what she believed in. At 9, she went into Mr. Damien's office. The director was serious, but when he saw Hannah, he smiled and said, "Ready?" She said yes, but her voice almost cracked. He put a hand on her shoulder and said, "Remember, speak simply, the way you speak. You understand this better than anyone here." The boardroom was on the top floor of the company. It was huge, with a long table and glass windows from which you could see the entire city. The board members were all there, men in suits, folders on the table, phones in hand. They seemed impatient, as if they didn't want to waste time on small matters. Mr. Damien introduced Hannah. He said she had been with the company for almost 10 years and had important information to share. One of the board members looked at her with a doubtful expression, as if thinking, what could this woman possibly know that we don't? Hannah felt her face flush, but she didn't look away. She began slowly. Her voice was quiet at first, but it soon grew firmer. She told them about the machines that were always breaking down, about the waste in the inventory, about old clients who could come back if production were faster. She spoke while looking each board member in the eye. She used simple words, nothing too technical. For every piece of data she mentioned, she pointed to it in the report. And most incredibly, no one interrupted. At one point, one of the board members, the oldest man, shook his head and said, "But what you're talking about costs a lot of money to fix. How can we be sure it will provide a return?" Hannah took a deep breath and replied, "Because I'm there every day. I see what's sitting idle, what's being thrown away, and I know where we can save money without firing anyone." The silence in the room was so profound you could hear the sound of the street far below. The board member looked at her for a few seconds and then said, "Continue." It was the first time in many years that someone had asked Hannah to keep talking. She went on to explain about the unsold stock. She said that if they organized sales better, they could move those products and turn a loss into incoming cash. She talked about how small adjustments to the machines could reduce maintenance costs, and most importantly, she said the company didn't need to fire anyone if they worked smarter. In the middle of her speech, Hannah saw Carlos standing outside the room, watching everything through a crack in the glass door. For a second, she almost lost her rhythm, but she took a deep breath and continued, because in that instant, she understood that she wasn't there to prove anything to Carlos. She was there to save the company, and to save herself. When she finished speaking, Hannah was red-faced, her heart racing, but with the feeling that she had done something huge. Mr. Damien was smiling. One of the board members started tapping lightly on the table, as if in approval. Another said, "Why has no one ever told us this before?" The director replied, "Because no one ever let her speak." Hannah sat down, breathing heavily. She knew she hadn't won everything yet, but for the first time, she felt she was being heard as a professional, as someone who had value, and more than that, as someone who would no longer accept being silenced. When the meeting ended, the board members were talking among themselves, exchanging papers, asking quick questions to Mr. Damien. Hannah just sat there, her hands on her folder, her heart still racing. It felt like her chest was full of air, as if she had just climbed a mountain. The oldest board member turned to her and said, "Hannah, do you have more reports like this? I'd like you to prepare a complete study on costs for our next meeting." Hannah could hardly believe what she was hearing. She said yes, that she would prepare everything. The man gave a slight smile, a rare sight for him, and said, "Congratulations, you saved this company today." Mr. Damien waited for the board members to leave and turned to Hannah. He said, "I'm very proud of you, not just for the courage to speak, but for your competence." Hannah blushed, not knowing what to say. The director continued, "I want to talk later about another matter. I think it's time for you to take on more responsibilities around here." Hannah was breathless for a moment. She had never dreamed so high. When she left the room, several employees were waiting outside, curious to know what had happened. Some began to applaud lightly as she passed. Cesar, from IT, approached and said, "Hannah, you did amazing. You have no idea how much you inspired us." Hannah smiled, emotional. For the first time, she didn't feel like running from the stairs. Carlos, on the other hand, was leaning against the wall, his face grim. Hannah passed by him and said, "Good work, Carlos," and kept walking. She didn't say it mockingly, but as someone who was no longer afraid. Carlos didn't answer. He just stood there, watching her go. In her department, everyone started to gather around. Lucy, from finance, said, "Hannah, you gave me courage today. I've always wanted to speak in meetings, but I never could." Hannah put a hand on her shoulder and said, "We have to speak up, Lou. If we don't speak, no one knows what we think." That day, Hannah barely managed to work. She went from one side of the company to the other, being called over by people who had never paid her much attention. They wanted to know details of the report, asked for her opinion on small day-to-day problems. She answered everything, calmly, but still with a knot in her stomach, not knowing if this was all real or if, the next day, she would wake up and everything would be back to normal. On her way out, Hannah passed the hallway where the pictures of the oldest employees were hung. She stopped in front of her own photo, taken years before, when she had been awarded Employee of the Month. She looked at that quiet, shy face and thought of everything she had endured in silence, and especially how much she had kept inside for so long. She took the bus home, sat by the window, and looked at the city lights. She thought of Roger, of Pete, of Sonia, the cleaning lady, of so many people who also spend their lives swallowing their words, just because no one lets them speak. She thought that somehow she wanted to help other people not to live like that anymore. When she got home, Roger was sitting on the sofa, almost anxiously. He asked how it had been. Hannah dropped her bag on the floor and started telling him everything at once. She said the board had listened, that they had praised her, that they asked for more reports. She said Mr. Damien wanted to talk about new plans for her. Roger's eyes were shining. He said, "I'm so proud of you, Hannah. You have no idea." Hannah sat next to him and rested her head on his shoulder. They sat there in silence for a few minutes, just breathing together, until Hannah said, her voice low, "You know what's craziest? I always knew I had something to say. They just wouldn't let me." Roger squeezed her hand and said, "And now no one will ever shut you up again." That night, Hannah lay in bed, but it took her a while to fall asleep. She kept replaying every second of the meeting, the surprised faces, the attentive looks, and she thought that maybe the biggest victory of all wasn't saving the company, but finally winning the right to be heard. The next morning, Hannah arrived at the company more confident than ever. She wore a light-colored blouse, her hair down, her stride firm. When she entered the hallway, some people greeted her with a "Good morning, Hannah," as if they were speaking to someone important, and for the first time, she felt comfortable with it. Mr. Damien called her into his office early. He asked her to sit and said, "Hannah, I've given it a lot of thought. You need to take on more responsibilities here. I want you to be the coordinator of the administrative department." Hannah was speechless for a few seconds. She had never imagined such a position. The director continued, "I know you don't have the title, but you have the competence, and I want someone who really knows this company." She asked if she would have support, if she could continue to speak her mind. Mr. Damien laughed and replied, "That's exactly why I want you in this position, because now I know you will speak." Hannah felt her eyes well up with tears, but she took a deep breath so she wouldn't cry in front of him. She accepted the new challenge. She knew she would be scared. She knew there would be people rooting against her, but she didn't want to live in silence anymore. At the factory, the news spread quickly. Some were happy, others not so much. Carlos, especially, passed Hannah in the hallway and said in an ironic tone, "Congratulations, boss." Hannah simply replied, "Thank you, Carlos. You can count on me to help with whatever you need." And she kept walking. She didn't want to fight, but she also wasn't going to bow her head to anyone anymore. In the days that followed, Hannah began to take on her new duties. She started having frequent meetings with Mr. Damien, participating in meetings with suppliers, reviewing contracts. At first, she was nervous, but with each meeting, she felt more confident, and she realized that often, people just needed to hear someone speak simply and directly to understand things. She also started to invite other women in the company to talk. Lucy, from finance, came to her office one day and said, "Hannah, I wanted to thank you. You gave me courage. This week in the meeting, I spoke up for the first time." Hannah smiled and said, "That's how it starts, Lou. One word at a time." Caesar, from IT, started coming to her office frequently, not just for work matters, but to chat. One day, he told her, "You know, You proved you don't have to shout to be heard. You have to speak right, with truth. That makes all the difference." Hannah was moved, because for a long time, she thought the problem was just that she was too quiet. Now she saw that the problem was that no one had given her the space to speak. A month later, Hannah was called to present her report at a large meeting, this time to a group of investors who were interested in helping the company. She went up to the conference room with her folder in hand, but she was no longer trembling. She looked at those men in suits and began to speak in her own way, simple, clear, firm. When she finished, she received applause. And more importantly, she was heard from beginning to end, without anyone interrupting. When she returned to her department, she sat at her desk, took a deep breath, and thought about everything that had happened in the last few months. She thought about how many times she had left meetings in tears, how many times she had stayed silent, swallowing her words. And now, she was here, not only being heard, but helping to save the company. That day, before leaving, Hannah passed by the reception and saw Sonia, the cleaning lady, organizing some folders. Sonia smiled and said, "I heard you're the boss now." Hannah smiled too and said, "I'm not the boss, Sonia. I'm just saying everything I know." The lady shook her head and replied, "Then keep talking, my dear, because good people who speak too little are what this world needs most." Hannah left there with a light heart. She took the bus home, sat by the window, and looked at the city passing by outside. She thought of Roger, of Pete, of her friends at the factory. She thought of all the women and men who, every day, swallow their words for fear of being interrupted, and she felt proud of herself. In that instant, she knew she would never go back to being the silent woman she was before, because now, she knew she had the right to speak. And more than that, she knew she had a lot of important things to say.
All right, it's that time. If this story has you hooked, let's do the full ritual. Hit the like button to support the channel, subscribe so you don't miss a beat, and ring that bell to be the first to know what's coming. Your opinion is golden, so drop it in the comments below.